Hello and welcome back to another video. Today marks the 10th anniversary of the iPad. On this day in 2010, Steve Jobs announced the first iPad, and at first people didn't know what to think about it. They just thought that it was just a bigger iPod or just a bigger iPhone. But within a year after it happened, the iPad turned into a revolutionary product. And now, 10 years later, we have such iPads that can do so many great things. And no one has really beat Apple in the last 10 years in the tablet industry. So, without further ado, today I want to take a retro look at the first iPad that was released 10 years ago. This model is the 32 gig Wi-Fi model. Now, I didn't buy this on eBay. In fact, we used to use it as kids. We actually bought this iPad just a few days before the iPad 2 came out. So that was back in 2011. So not exactly 10 years ago, but kind of close to it. I remember watching YouTube on here, playing Angry Birds, and various stuff on here. And luckily, throughout these years, it still works. And it still unlocks, and it runs the latest version that it supports, which is iOS 5.1.1. Now, what can you do with this iPad 10 years later? Well, not very much. This iPad does not have a camera. It also doesn't have FaceTime or services that iPad would have today. On iOS 5, at least as of now, you can't really get much on this iPad app-wise. And if you try downloading an app like YouTube or Netflix, it won't work unless you jailbreak it. Although on the YouTube app, even if you did jailbreak it, it wouldn't work still. So yeah, so what all I want to do is just kind of do a walkthrough, like a tour of this iPad. Now this iPad is kind of thick. It's like a half-inch thick. That's what they said. It's 1.5 pounds. It does feel a lot heavier than normal iPads like this iPad, which is an iPad Air 2. Is, even with the case on, it's significantly lighter than this iPad by itself. Now, you did have messages, and you could text people with it, but it is only MMS, which, for iPad, it can only text other iPhones and such like that. It has your calendar app, the skeuomorphic look. I personally like this. I just like it a lot. I remember using this. The Notes app, it's kind of the same, although you can draw in the Notes app. The reminders hasn't really changed very much at all. In fact, even the design. Some other features that you got was the first version of Apple Maps, which sucked, and I will show you. Like, there would be some land lines, like Africa would extend down here, and Greenland would go up there, and in the 3D view, it was just not very good. But Apple did apologize and said that they were trying to release a version of Maps be nice to have, but they just didn't get it quite right yet. But now the iPad Apple Maps app is really good, just as good, if not even better than Google Maps. Although Apple Maps doesn't quite have Street View yet, but they will, at least in the US, in the near future. The YouTube app's on here. This is the last version of iOS with the YouTube app, although it doesn't work anymore because back in 2012, I think Google quit servicing the YouTube app, and they created their own app. The Videos app on here, it's basically just a media app for movies and TV shows. You just sync your movies with iTunes. Doesn't really have any subscriptions like Apple TV Plus, which is what the Contacts app is, just normal. Although it looks weird how it's just a book. It's literally just a book. Like, you have these margins here, and I think that Apple fixed that in iOS 7. Although I'd have to double check my sources. Game Center, of course, the old pool table look, the green cloth, and all that. The iTunes Store, I think it still works. Yep, it's loading. Although you can't get Apple Music on here, although it still advertises it. Go get Apple Music if you upgrade. The App Store, which is still on here, although you can't really get anything anymore. iOS 5 got too old. But yeah, you can see the games and stuff on here. It looks like Minecraft's on there twice. Apparently they call it Apple Books, and back a couple years ago they started calling that, and they just implemented it in iOS. Newsstand, although Newsstand, is just kind of like Apple Books. It's kind of like another feature. The Settings app, we were already in here. The Settings app could do quite a lot. You had iCloud for the first time, although iCloud didn't come till iOS 5, so the iPad didn't have iCloud until then. Yeah, other stuff on here like the old Twitter doesn't look like that anymore. You have wallpaper, the picture frame. I don't know if Apple does that anymore. They might, I don't know. You'll have to double check on that one with me. It does have landscape, might as well show that off. First Apple device with landscape that can be oriented to it. Then we have the Mail app with all your different mail options. And the Photos app, although the only way you could get photos on here is through PhotoStream or syncing with iTunes, which when you do, it's kind of nice to have them on here because you have a big screen to look at the photos. The Music app, this was on here. I don't have any music on here right now. I might put some. I don't know why. I don't plan on listening to music on here, but if you did, it'd show up here. You'd probably have great cover flow. I don't know if it does have cover flow, but yeah. And then there's Safari, which is the first version of Safari with private browsing, and I'll just load up a quick site like Google, and as you can see, it loads pretty quickly. Still pretty quick. I know on iOS 4 it's a little bit slower. So, there's that. You have Spotlight Search, and you do have notifications as well as multitasking. And you can, the classic cross out, classic unlock sound and lock sound is on there. That's the view of the software side of the iPad. Now, the hardware side, other than that, it's a freaking beast. It's thick. This thing can withstand like anything. Like, throw it down your stairs, you'll be fine. Totally drop it out of your car. Like, if you accidentally drop it out of your car, like when you're getting gas or something, it won't crack. You did have one mono speaker, which, you know, at the time was completely fine. Like, the first iPod Touch didn't even have a speaker. It was just like an iPod where you had to plug in headphones in order to listen. You did have these plastic keys. You did have a ringer switch. That was iPads don't really have that anymore. So yeah, the buttons on here aren't as gummy as like the first generation iPhone buttons. But yeah, Apple didn't use metal buttons until like the iPad Air and iPad Mini. It does have the 30-pin dock. 4 iPads had the 30-pin dock. So this iPad, a couple years ago, like, it wouldn't charge at one point, and I don't know why. It was probably because we had a faulty cable, but it charges fine now. And although this iPad, speaking of battery, has like legendary standby time, and just leave it on the table like that, you'll come back in like a month, maybe even more. Apple says a month, but I believe it's more, especially for this first iPad. You'll come back to it and it'll still have like charge, like maybe 30%, maybe 20% charge. Like, this thing is freaking awesome when it comes to standby time. People say that this iPad should have went to like iOS 7, like the iPhone 4 did, because this did come with the A4 chip. Now, the reason why Apple didn't update this software is because it only had an A4 chip and only 256 megabytes of RAM. Now, the iPhone 4 got iOS 7 because it had a half gigabyte of RAM, but it didn't run well on iOS 7 either. So, Apple did respond to some of the people's controversy by keeping the iPad 2 around until iOS 9. Now, like the 4S, that is way too long in my opinion. They should have stopped that iPad at like iOS 7 or iOS 8 because iOS 9, if you own a 4S or have seen a 4S perform on iOS 9 or an iPad 2, you know that it is like basically unusable because of how slow it is. So that's why Apple didn't update this past iOS 5, which I think was a good decision on their half. That's what this iPad's all about. The designs would still look nice today. This flat edge is still used in the current iPad Pros. Obviously the bezel isn't. No home button, at least on the Pro iPads. This is not a Retina display. That didn't come until the iPad 3, I think. Correct me if I'm wrong. This was a very usable iPad back from 2010 to like 2012 and even a few years after that. I personally don't use this iPad for anything. I just collect it. Still sell pretty cheap online as collector's items. In fact, they still sell like brand new ones for like $400 if you're like really wanting to collect like a new one. I don't know what else to say about this iPad other than that it was a great first iPad for Apple. They really did well on this, and they couldn't have done any better for a first iPad. It could have been a lot worse. And if you want to see worse, go look at some of the first Android tablets. They are not as good as the first iPad. So yeah, that's all I have for you guys today. Just a retro look at this iPad. It is, again, it's 10 years old today. we have come a long way with our iPads and tablets. That's all I have for you today. I'll see you in the next video.